And we're rolling.
Hey.
Okay. So, you were asking me whether I had any ideas about what we were going to talk about on this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Tell you the truth, I kind of have loads of ideas, but I don't really have them in any sort of order.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose that my basic sort of rationale for why I think this is maybe a worthwhile project is that I've heard quite a lot of these kind of podcasts, I haven't heard quite a lot of these kind of podcasts, but I've heard quite a lot of conversations that have been recorded in one context or another, where essentially you don't have that much more than two people talking to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that basically if you have two people talking to each other and they have a reasonable sort of rapport, then that can actually be interesting to listen to, particularly because, we've become so good at media production of different kinds has become so slick and professional that I think people actually really want to listen to something that's not so produced, that's kind of
not very contrived,
done with all that kind of thing. But I think that the sort of circumstances of us knowing each other and being friends and stuff is actually relatively unusual. I think that...
You mean the circumstances are unusual?
I mean, I don't think there are... you can find that many people from our particular backgrounds who met in a city in the east of Ukraine.
Sure, and
I just think that those basic facts: a British guy and an Indian guy who happened to meet one evening in a bar in the east of Ukraine. That's a relatively unusual sort of backstory. Just those bare facts.
Definitely, and I had an idea for one of the early topics that we could cover that sort of neatly segues into this. It is the sort of low-hanging fruit when you talk about the backgrounds that we come from. To discuss the colonial past would be something that would sort of be something that's obviously expected of us to speak about, and something that I think both of us have some amount of density of opinion on. So I thought we could talk about...
You mean specifically the sort of British and Indian interactions in the past, or you mean...
Not necessarily, just British imperialism
colonialism
and colonialism in general. It's interesting that we find ourselves, because of our backgrounds, on the opposing ends of this historical event, or say historical duality of that of the imperial power and the colonized entity.
Mm-hmm. I think this is quite interesting in a Ukrainian context because obviously that's a colonized country.
And we spoke about it once. It is a subjugated country. But if this context of European colonialism, whether it can fit into that sort of context, is something that to me is to be debated.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it's definitely a different situation, more sort of complicated situation, but I think it has some comparable features because you obviously have some components of straightforward sort of power of one country against another, but then you also have this sort of cultural intermingling that goes on during that process that means that Russian influence can't just be straightforwardly expunged in Ukraine any more than British influence can be expunged from India, right?
And in that context, it is worse because while a lot of our cultural beliefs as a population have been sort of corrupted, if I can use that word, by British influence, in the sense that many people don't know that they are British influences. Like that's why I use the
Sure.
word corrupted. Like
Sure.
there are a lot of cultural sort of tenets that have entered the Indian collective mind that the Indian mind does not know to be British. They think it's Indian, and that's
Sure.
tragic. And I can imagine that's happened a lot more here, because Russia is like a neighboring country, a fellow Slavic country, and I'm guessing it was much harder to distinguish Russian cultural features from Ukrainian ones, and so the loss,
Yeah, sure.
the loss in terms of cultural capital, I think, is higher here.
Here being Ukraine.
In Ukraine, compared to, say, India. I haven't been to many other colonized countries, like post-colonial countries, but yeah, definitely much higher than in India. I feel like India's managed to retain some sort of authentic cultural identity for whatever that's worth, but it's managed to retain that to a large extent. People engage in practices and rituals and cultural ideals that they've been engaging in for a very, very long time, 10 centuries at the least, and like I said, while a lot of these have been corrupted to some extent, irreparably by foreign influence, a lot of these are still intact, and that's something to celebrate, I think.
Sure, and well, I suppose that India is much older as a culture than any, or not just Ukraine, but than any European nation.
Sure.
So, that presumably goes a long way to explaining that. Okay, this is a very short talk, so I think that is definitely something we could discuss, and it could be interesting to get a Ukrainian person to join us in that conversation. Perhaps that would help us to flesh out that that sort of dimension of it, perhaps.
Yeah, who do you think would be a good person from for this task from the people we know?
Well, I think we can't maybe discuss that very easily while the tape's rolling, because I guess we have to ask people whether or not that's something they want to do. But maybe that's something for us to discuss between now and our next recording.
Sure.
We're obviously doing this in a very sort of exposed and deconstructed way, without wanting to sound sort of pretentious about it. This podcast is like one of those radios that was quite popular in the 90s that was made out of transparent plastic, where you can sort of see the internal workings, albeit not to very much effect. But we've decided that instead of, we've consciously avoided having very many too many conversations about this before we started, because we wanted the conversations that that sort of that would form the genesis of this podcast to be its early episodes, and that obviously may doom the project from the start, because it might be that this sort of rambling, formless stop and start is completely unlistenable to, but well, I guess that's just the risk we're taking. But I wonder whether perhaps we should give some of our own backstories, because we've made vague reference to, or I've made vague reference to our origins and the circumstances of our meeting.
Seeing as my name is alphabetically the first one, I'll start.
Okay.
My name is Abhishek, Nagaraj Abhishek. I come from India, a small state in India called Tamil Nadu in the south of India. I've been living for the last few years in the city of Kharkiv in Ukraine, which is like about 30 kilometers from the border of Russia. It's here that I met Joe, the other member of this podcast. Like he said a little earlier, we just met in a bar one evening, quite randomly, and
okay, I feel like you've skipped ahead a little bit. Let's hear like a bit more about, I don't know, how old you were when you arrived and what it was like coming from Tamil Nadu to Kharkiv.
Well, I was 17. I was absolutely itching to get here, because it was just something that the idea was something I was just madly in love with already, even before it happened. I was just really keen on.
Why?
Well, it just sounded very otherworldly, and it didn't sort of seem like a possibility for my life even months before it actually happened. So it was, I mean, I'd never been abroad. I'd never been on an international flight, let alone alone. I'd never sort of been outside my parents' sphere of control ever. Um, just the idea of being alone and sort of being allowed to explore the world from such a different sort of point was really exciting. And
yeah, I mean, to me, this is unimaginable. The idea of having your first trip outside the country being a solo flight to, well, such a different country, such a different place.
Such a different place, and it was just, yeah, like you said, it wasn't just a trip. I just before getting on that flight, I just decided that I would spend the next 6 years of my life in this country, and I had enrolled myself as a student, and obviously we had measures, like if something had gone wrong, we had like contingency plans or whatever, but the idea was that I was going to spend the next 6 years of my life there. And I'm surprised now, looking back in retrospect, at how little I was scared, like how little concern I had for things that could have gone wrong. Like I absolutely had no space in my mind to think about anything other than all the things I wanted to do, how exciting it would be to sort of live amongst an alien people, like you say, an alien culture. I was absolutely sort of not concerned. I probably should have been.
But well, that's the lucky thing about the things you do at that point in your life, I guess, is that if you had any sense, you wouldn't do them, or if you knew more, then you maybe wouldn't do them. But that's the lucky thing about being young and naive.
Yeah, I was very naive. But the whole year seems like a bigger chunk of time, a substantially bigger chunk of time than a year. That first year for me in Ukraine, like in my in terms of the density of memories and the density of new neural connections that I made in that time, it just feels like a 2-3 year period of my life when I look back at it.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? I often think that about, well, just the 3 years that I spent as a university student, which is quite a short period of time, relatively speaking, and now I think 3 years can go by, and things that happened 3 years ago, I think of them as having happened, virtually yesterday. That's
Exactly.
the very recent past in terms of the pace of my sort of my mental clock now, but then that your time as a student is almost this sort of self-contained world, and you start at kind of the moment zero, and your moment of graduation you think of as being the end. So it takes on much bigger proportions. Abi, will you say sort of why you decided to venture outside of India to undertake your studies?
For the longest time, I was sure that I wanted to study medicine in university, without getting into the details of why this is what I wanted. And for those who don't know, studying medicine in India is a very, very, very chancy proposition, because there are very, very few places that can be had. The year I wrote the exam, there were, if I remember right, close to 350,000 students competing for about 20,000 places.
Right.
So obviously I didn't make the cut there. My parents decided that sending me to Ukraine, which would give me a degree that would be recognized in India, was a better idea than shelling out $100,000 as an upfront one-time capitation fee to an Indian private university. So that's why I got here. I mean, I did consider, I was offered place to study dentistry and pharmacology, but I was pretty sure back then that I wanted to study medicine.
Okay. Well, that's like a pause in our conversation. Actually, that's good because you've got to go.
Yeah.
And this is the end of this recording.
Cool.
So until next time.